Parole. Veillez à être respectueux du causeur. C'est 1 heure, ça va pas vous tuer. Donc pas de bruit s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Comme ça, ils supportent pas le format. Ah, ok.
On va mettre le micro là parce que de la...
Ah oui, mais... Ah.
Pour la vidéo. Parce qu'elle a une vidéo. Ah, c'est ça?
On verra.
Tu es aussi bonne que moi en informatique.
Il n'y a pas de jack dessus?
Non, bah c'est bien avec le micro, on a dit, hein, ça marche.
Attends.
Bien. Parce que c'est...
Pas de jack dessus, donc non, ouais. Ça sera pas possible.
Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here today, and thank you to the Causerie team for welcoming me here today. So my name is Joanna, and I'm here to talk to you about intercultural relations in the workplace. Okay, the idea is for me to give you a brief overview of what culture is, and for us to exchange our ideas on what culture is, to discuss cultural dimensions, and to talk about developing our cultural intelligence in our global economy. It's an essential skill for us all to have. Okay, but first, a little bit about me. So I'm a little bit like Obelix. I fell into the intercultural cauldron when I was very young. So my father is Indian, my mother is Belgian. I was born in Brazil. I grew up there, and then I moved to Belgium, then I moved to England, and I've now been living in France for about 20 years. So in terms of interculturality, it's something I'm familiar with. I work in an intercultural context. I work with people from all over the world. So it's something that I'm happy with and I live with on a daily basis. In terms of my background, I have an MSc in international HR and specializing in international mobility. I have worked for 20 years as in HR, and I now work as an independent coach and trainer supporting people with their career transitions and also raising awareness about intercultural management and gender diversity. Okay, so that's me. Over to you. So we're going to talk about culture. So first of all, I'd like to show you a picture and I'd like you to tell me what words come to mind. What do you see? Okay, you see a map. Is this a normal map? I see some of you turning your heads. Is it the usual map? Is that the map you're used to working with? No, right. What's different about it? It's upside down. It's the wrong way around. Yes. It is indeed, absolutely. Okay. This is a world map, but taken from an Australian perspective. So this Australian guy in the 1950s got fed up of seeing the world from a Eurocentric point of view, and he said, okay, we're going to sort that out now, and we're going to look at the world from our point of view. So what does this tell us about culture? So it tells us many things. That culture is something that is individual, and it's depending where we come from, we view the world in different ways. So it's symbolic. And what's also symbolic is how we react to this kind of map. We tend to say it's odd, it's strange, it's wrong, it's a wrong way round. So that's typical of our reaction to a different culture when we first encounter it. Okay, so what words come to mind when you think about culture? Give me some words. Pardon? People. Did you say people? Okay. What words come to mind when you think of culture? Language. Thank you. What else? Food. Yes. French. Pardon? Traditions. Yes. Religion. Good. Okay. Habits. Festivals. Climate. Okay. History. Good. Would anyone like to venture a definition, a dictionary definition of culture? It's much more tricky to pin it down. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce you to one of the intercultural experts that I'm sure you've heard of. It's someone called Geert Hofstede, so a Dutch guy who did incredible work on the subject of intercultural management in the 60s and 70s. So he says that culture is the collective mental programming of the human mind which distinguishes one group of people from another. So the key words here are collective. So in other words, it belongs to a group. Okay? Mental programming because it's something that we integrate without actually knowing. It's something that we learn without actually being kind of taught formally. We sort of understand, we learn through trial and error what is acceptable and not acceptable in our cultures, but it's not something that someone sits down and says, this is how we do it here in France or England or wherever. Okay? And it's so integrated and it's so much part of our lives and our way of thinking and doing that we don't realize it until we've met another group. And it's only when you meet another group that you think, hang on a minute, they don't do things the way we do. They do things differently. That's wrong or it's weird or whatever. So our first encounter of our own culture, if you like, or recognition of our own culture comes when we meet another. Okay, hence the collective programming. And as you said before, there are different elements that define culture. Okay, we talked about them earlier. And Hofstede says that our programming is built on three things. The first one is the fact that we're all human, so we all have the capacity to feel love, hate, anger, joy, okay? But what determines how we express it, how we express our joy, our anger, our hate, whatever, is determined by our culture. And then everyone is an individual. So our personalities also shape how we express our different emotions. So when we talk about culture, culture is actually a very complex thing. It's not just British, French, German, Russian, whatever. It's, it's elements of those national culture elements, but also of the individual. And we should always remember that when we meet someone new. And culture is a very complex thing in terms of where it comes from and in terms of how it influences and shapes us. We learn a lot from our family, so we have our own family culture. All you have to do is have dinner at someone else's house to understand that they don't do things the way we do. Regional cultures. Okay, apparently 80% of cultural differences exist within national borders and not between countries. Okay, so if you think about someone coming from Marseille, it will be very different, as you know, from someone coming from Lille or Strasbourg. Okay, so regional differences are very important. Okay, national we've talked about. Professionals. Okay, you guys, I don't know how many of you are HR, but my kind of professional culture is very different from someone who works in finance or in sales or in marketing. Okay, and then you have the corporate culture. Someone working in Danone won't have the same culture as someone working for Peugeot. Okay, so culture is a very complex thing, and we have different layers of culture. So let's look at the cultures in this room. So how many of you come from Europe? Okay, how many of you come from South America? Yay! How many of you come from Asia? Okay. How many of you are not engineers? Okay. I have some friends here. No, not at all. Joking. Okay, so how many of you are over the age of 40? Okay, and then we have men and women. We have people who have different walks of life, different professions. Okay, so culture is not just nations, but it's also different layers of our lives. Okay, think about the cultures you meet on a day-to-day. Okay, here we are today, but you also have cultures that you meet on a daily basis. What do you enjoy about that? What do you enjoy about meeting other cultures? What's fun? What's exciting? Anyone care to venture? So when we meet other cultures, yes, absolutely. So we learn a lot from other people. Okay, what else? We eat different. We dress different. Okay, so meeting other cultures gives us a chance to do things differently, to experience different things, to taste, to read, to hear different things. It's wonderfully rewarding and satisfying and exciting and very positive overall. But culture can also be difficult at times. It can be challenging. In what way? Yes, language. If we don't understand each other, okay, there can be terrible tensions if you're working in a team with with people from different nationalities. A lot of time can be wasted in misunderstandings, and that has an impact on the team spirit and how we get on. And it can have a very detrimental effect on the project itself. Okay. So we have risk of tension, we have risk of conflict, of misunderstanding overall, and the project, whatever it is that we're working on, failing completely. Okay, so there are real challenges. How many of you have lived abroad? Okay, so you will all be familiar with culture shock. This is something we talk about when we talk about culture, the experience of culture shock. So culture shock is when you enter a new culture. So typically when you go and live in a foreign country. But this also applies, by the way, when you actually work in a different new company. You'll go through the same stages. So the first stage being, wow, isn't it wonderful? We love it here. I love the way they dress. I love the way, I love the weather. I love, the scenery, the food. And then after a few weeks or months, we start feeling homesick and we start thinking, oh God, I hate this weather and this food. I'm sick of it. Give me fish and chips any time of the day. Okay. So we go through this down period, which can lead to depression if we don't handle it. It can actually be very serious. Okay. And then comes a time when people either go home because they can't stand it anymore, or they learn to adjust. And then we go back up the curve, and then we come to a place where we accept. Okay, we manage the cultural differences. We are aware that we are not in our culture, but we enjoy what's different. And when we need to seek refuge in things that are home, then we go and find people from our culture. We speak to our families. We eat comfort foods, whatever. Okay, so we learn to manage it. And what's really funny about culture shock is reverse culture shock, which means that you go through the whole process again when you go home. So you start being really happy to be home again, and then you realize that people haven't any understanding of what you've been through, what you've lived through, and so you go down again into that depression mode where you're a bit lost, a bit disorientated, and then we have time to readjust, recover, and we're back to where we were. Different, we have changed, but we are different, but we do go back into a sort of form of acceptance. Okay, so culture shock is typically an example of how challenging culture and living in a different culture can be. Okay, here's another expert for you. His name is Edgar Schein. Okay. Now he says that culture exists at different levels. Okay, culture, when we think around culture, it is not objective. Okay, what we think of other cultures is just one perspective. Okay, when we view other cultures, it's through the prism of our own. So if I were to ask you what you think of the British, because you are different nationalities here, you may not have the same perspective. For example, and if you ask an Indian what he thinks of the French, they'll say they're very disciplined and organized. If you ask the Germans what they think of the French, I think you'll find that a lot of them think the French are lazy and disorganized. So perspective is very different depending where you come from, and how we interpret culture comes from, it depends on where we come from. Okay, we tend, also when we meet another culture, we tend to focus on what is different and not what is the same. And in fact, a lot of things can be very similar, especially when you're thinking about values. Okay, and finally, thinking about cultural stereotypes, we have them all over. All you have to do is watch the film or watch the telly, see the adverts. Cultural stereotypes, go on and are constantly kind of reinforced. So we need to be wary that these are stereotypes and that they are not the truth. Okay, I'm going to test you now and see how good you are with your cultural stereotypes. Who are they? So you have a choice of 5 nationalities. Who are they? Who are the hardworking, diligent, disciplined nation? Is that unanimous, I wonder? You say the Germans? Okay, number 1 is indeed the Germans. Okay, according to this survey, and it's a really interesting survey, and it's a book called Pourquoi les Français sont les moins fréquentables de la planète. A very funny book about cultural stereotypes if you want to read about it. Anyway, so number 1, you're right, it's the Germans. Number 2, efficient, individualistic, patriotic. Americans, again, unanimous, okay. Number 3, fiercely loyal to their companies and formidable competitors. The Japanese, okay. Number 4, refined, seducers, great talkers. Okay, no doubts there, Italians. And finally, ecologically minded, socially advanced, and reliable. Okay, we consider them to be the Swedish. Okay, so these are cultural stereotypes. It is not the truth, okay. What, dare I ask, are your stereotypes about the British? They love tea. Yes, we do. Well, actually, that's not true. British drink more coffee than tea, would you believe? We're very polite. Thank you for saying so. We have the Queen, yes. Pardon? I'm afraid I can't hear you. So yes, we have the Queen, we like our tea, we like our beer. These are very positive. I'm very impressed. In my 20 years here, I've had lots of positive and some negative comments about the British, but let's stick with the positive. Okay, so cultural stereotypes color the way we view other cultures. Okay, so we have an opinion about different cultures, but we mustn't forget that they have an opinion about us. Okay, so when we meet someone from a different culture, they also have their cultural stereotypes in their minds. So what do you think people say about the French? Pardon? Dirty, yes, we have this thing that we say that the French don't wash. Hence why they have such a great perfume industry. Okay, what else? What else do we say about the French? Well, I'm going to show you a little video that will demonstrate what the world thinks of the French. Hang on. Let's hope it works. Let's hope it works. It doesn't work. Hooray. Hang on. Let me start again. Hang on. Okay, it was working. There we
L'image que j'ai des Français est celle d'un peuple arrogant, même si je n'y suis jamais allé. C'est l'image que j'en ai à cause de la télévision et de ce qu'on en dit.
Les Français sont très organisés et respectés. Ils sont conscients de leurs droits et ils savent quoi revendiquer. J'aime vraiment ça, cette relation entre le gouvernement et ses citoyens.
Ils fument beaucoup trop et ils peuvent être, ils peuvent être arrogants un peu. En revanche, ils ont un goût vestimentaire original.
J'étais élevé au principe français, aux fraternité, égalité, à la révolution. C'est ça pour moi l'identité française.
Les gens sont adorables. Ils ont un grand sens de l'humour et ils ont l'air très détendus.
C'est intéressant de voir que la France se penche sur des questions raciales, alors qu'aux États-Unis, cela fait des générations qu'on a réglé cette question. On n'associe pas l'identité ethnique à l'identité nationale. Tout le monde est américain. Tant que vous êtes né aux États-Unis, vous êtes américain. Et ceci n'est pas remis en cause.
Well, I'm glad that made you laugh. Okay. As I said, stereotypes are what they're worth. Okay, they're interesting. They tell you a lot about how you are perceived. But as you can see, sometimes it's very, very far from the truth, right? Oh, haven't gone. Right, next picture. What do you see? So we're in the airport lounge. Okay, it's arrivals. People are arriving. And all they're doing is saying hello. And look how complicated it is to say hello. You've got people holding out their hands, people holding out their business cards. This lady here is clearly invading his personal space. Not happy. Is she going for the bees? Is she not? Not sure. Okay. And this guy, joining his hands. So a simple thing like saying hello can be a minefield, absolute minefield. Okay. What does this say about culture? Again, it says that it's integrated. We are so inside our own cultures that we don't realize that a simple thing like saying hello can have a tremendous impact on first impressions and how we get on with other people. Okay, this element of culture is what we use the cultural iceberg model to try and understand what's going on here. What it says is that what we call surface culture is what we see with our eyes. So how people dress, what they eat, in terms of behaviors, okay? But there is much, much more that we don't know about and that we don't understand and that we can't perceive, we can't see with our eyes. And it's only when you live with people, work with people, that you pick up on what drives them, what's integral part of their culture. Okay, and these things we have to learn. For example, think about eye contact. Some cultures, if you look at someone in the eye, it means that you're showing them respect, that you're looking at them. But if I don't look you in the eye, you may not have that same impression at all. Whereas in other cultures, looking someone in the eye is disrespectful. Okay, distance. We British, we don't like people coming too close. So if you come to speak to me and I start walking backwards, it's normal. It's not you, it's me. I don't like, as I say, British people are not good with proximity. Greeting someone, as we saw, can be a complicated process. The French, they use a tu and a vous. My God, how difficult is it for us? I still don't know, after 20 years, who I can tutoie and who I can vouvoie. Okay. Using first names the same, all right? In the business world, do I say vous? Do I say, use someone's name, or do I have to say monsieur, madame? Exchanging business cards. Socializing, is it okay to socialize with people from your own, that you work with? Punctuality, this is a great one. If I say to you, we're having a meeting tomorrow at 9, what time will you arrive? And if I asked you for dinner at my place, what time will you turn up? Okay. And there are subjects in cultures which are taboo and difficult to talk about. And things like giving presents. These are all coded, and you won't know until you've made a mistake or someone teaches you. Giving presents, I remember one of the first things I did when I arrived here 20 years ago was go to someone's house for dinner, and what did I take? A bunch of chrysanthemums. That did not go down well at all. So I've never done that again. Needless to say, I learned my lesson the hard way. Okay? So the flowers, chrysanthemums, you follow me? The chrysanthèmes. Okay, you don't do that in France? Okay. So in order to navigate this minefield of cultural dimensions, as we call them, so when we try and understand how other people function, how we relate to different things, experts have been trying and studying what we call deep culture, and they've identified things that they called cultural dimensions. So what aspects of human behavior do people or do people deal with differently? Okay, these are the cultural experts that I would recommend you read if you are interested. Edward Hall being the one that started the ball rolling back in the 40s and who did great work on, on distance. Okay, you have Gert Hofstede, we saw earlier, Franz Trompenaars. Philip Rosinski does great work on intercultural coaching, and Erin Meyer, who's an American living in Paris and teaching at INSEAD, if you can catch some of her conferences, if you're interested. And Erin Meyer wrote a book called The Cultural Map, and she has identified 8 cultural dimensions. Okay, so 8 points in which we differ in terms of culture. Okay, communication, evaluating, persuading, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. I wanted to focus on 4 of them. Evaluation, so giving feedback. In some cultures, we give feedback directly. I'm not happy with you. I say, I'm not happy with you. I'm not happy with your work. Okay? And in some cultures, it's not possible to do that. You have to go round the houses and do the British style, which is what we call the sandwich approach, which is we start off by saying something nice, and then we say what we really want to say, which is the negative feedback, and we finish off by saying something nice again, the sandwich. Okay? Now imagine I'm British and you're French, and you say to me something directly. What's my reaction going to be? If you say, Joanna, I'm not happy with your work, bearing in mind I'm coming from a culture where indirect negative feedback is not done, how do you think I will feel? How do you think your feedback will impact me? Exactly, I won't like it at all, and chances are I will be resentful, upset, and my motivation and performance will go shooting down. Okay. On the other hand, okay, I had this experience with an American and French duo that I was coaching. So this French lady had an American boss, and the American boss said, Joanna, I have a problem. I'm trying to tell her that I'm not happy with this aspect of her work. And I said, what have you told her? And he used the sandwich effect. So this French lady, every time I said, so how did it go with your boss in the meeting? She said, oh, he's really happy with my work. So in her mind, she completely squeezed the negative that was in his sandwich. All she heard was the positive. So constant misunderstanding between the two. And his reaction was, well, she's not learning. She's refusing to learn. Okay, so he was like, I can't work with this person. So it can have a real negative impacts on how we manage our careers and how, we kind of perceived by our peers and our managers. Okay, second one is trusting. So in some cultures, we develop trust by working together. And in others, building a relationship is essential. So when the British make fun of the French and say they're always having lunch, they're always, 2 hours for lunch is just ludicrous. Well, actually, those are the times when people in different cultures, and I'm taking the example of the French culture, when people build their relationships, which are essential for working together. Disagreeing, well, again, confrontational or not. If you disagree with me and you're confrontational about it, being British and not liking confrontation, I will be very offended. So our relationship will suffer. Okay? And scheduling, as we saw, is very dependent on cultures. Some have what we call linear time, which is 9 o'clock is 9 o'clock. And others have flexible time, a flexible approach to time, which means 9 o'clock can mean 9:15, 9:30, 10 o'clock, etc. Okay, so if you're working in a culture and you come from a linear time culture and you're working with people who are more flexible, it can be frustrating, okay, which is why it's important to know about this so you can adapt and communicate about these differences. Okay. Now, if you're interested in learning more about your own cultural profile, then I suggest you go and look on her website. She's the only one that provides this for free. Everyone else charges for the possibility of having a cultural profile. So it's a 20-question questionnaire online, which will tell you what your cultural profile is. And what's interesting is that she compares your results to your national results. So it kind of compares you to what French people are or English people are. It gives you kind of an interesting perspective. And she also compares your profile with different nations, other nations, so that you can compare how you are with relation to other nationalities. And as you can see from the bottom, She gives kind of indicators of what can go wrong in the communication and what you can do about it. So a really interesting website excuse me, for those who want to read into it a bit more. So culture is tricky. Culture is wonderful, but it's also tricky. And we need to understand how it works so that we can work effectively. So what are the risks if we don't know about cultural differences, if we don't know how to behave in a multicultural environment? What are the risks? What are the risks for a company? What are the risks for the manager? And for you as an individual? What can go wrong? Yep. So misunderstanding, conflict within the team, people not working effectively together, and the whole project going belly up. Okay. For a company, think of McDonald's. If they hadn't adapted their burgers to each country, do you think they'd be as successful as they are now? Okay. So for companies, the stakes are business development. If you don't adapt to the local cultures, you cannot sell your products effectively or your services. When you're negotiating, you're creating partnerships with different nations and different nationalities, it's important to know these differences so that you can be effective and not waste time in misunderstanding and even conflict, or run the risk of these partnerships breaking down. And when you're trying to attract people and, more importantly, retain people in your staff, you need to tap into what their cultural specificities are so that you're sending out the right messages. So as a manager, you need to know the cultural differences in your team so that you know how to communicate with them effectively, so that when you give feedback, you give it correctly in the way that they can hear it, so that you learn to engage them and are able to federate the team around them. Okay? And for you as an individual, well, knowing about cultural differences will help avoid misunderstandings, tensions, and conflict, and which will then not have an impact on your motivation and performance. Okay, so there is a point to intercultural management. It does have an impact when we don't take it seriously. Okay, so in our global economy, it's a skill that we need to develop. And we call it cultural intelligence. You know how we have IQ and EQ? Well, now we have CQ, which is cultural intelligence. And the Americans have come up with a psychometric test, which actually tests people for their CQ. So in order to work effectively in a multicultural environment, you have to develop your CQ, all right? And they define it as your capacity to adapt, as in adapt your behavior, okay, with people from other countries and other kind of cultural spheres. Okay, so when you have a high CQ, these are the things that make you, that characterize you. So someone with a high CQ is interested in experiencing cultural diversity, diverse settings. They have a wide understanding of intercultural situations, are able to anticipate what will happen in cross-cultural situations, and are able to adapt and adjust their verbal and non-verbal behaviors in order to respond to the situation that they're in. So it's a very sophisticated skill. It's not just a question of, can I speak French, but can I adapt? Can I pick up on the signals? Can I modify my behavior in relation to what's been presented to me in order to work effectively? Okay, so it's considered a very important skill for the 21st century. So how do we go about to develop it? Well, the first thing you need to do is have a clear understanding of who you are. Then you need to understand where you come from in terms of your culture. You have to challenge yourself on how you perceive other cultures and become knowledgeable about them. And then you develop your emotional intelligence. Okay, so knowing yourself, what does that mean? Think about your cultural heritage. Where do you come from in terms of cultural influences? Your family, your region, your town, your company, your profession. Your identities, how do they shape you? What are your preferences? Are you the kind of person who does give direct feedback? Are you the kind of person who, when it's 9 o'clock, it's 9 o'clock and not 9:10? Okay. think about your own stereotypes and prejudices. What do you think of other cultures? What kind of ideas are coloring your judgment? And what are your beliefs about what is right and wrong? What are your values? Okay, take a minute and have a look. Think about where you come from, what your cultural background is. As you can see, it's a very complex thing. So, know your culture is another important thing. Now, Gert Hofstadter says that culture is like an onion. There are layers to it. You can't just identify it by saying culture is this or French culture is that. There are different dimensions, and in order to decipher what a culture is, you need to study its symbols, its heroes, the rituals, and the values. Okay, the symbols, the things that represent a specific culture. The heroes tell you a lot about the influences of what good behavior is and what bad behavior is in a country. Okay, the rituals, how do people deal with birth? How do they deal with death? What do they do? What festivals do they celebrate and with what intent? Okay, what's important for them as a culture? And in terms of values, what's good, what's bad? In some countries, spitting on the floor is quite acceptable. In others, it's not. How do you know the difference? You study and you look. Okay? So every time you go into a new culture, think of these, think of the symbols, think of the heroes. It will give you clues as to what constitute that culture and how you can decipher it. So, before you enter a culture, you also need to challenge yourself on how you view cultures. We all think that we are culturally open, but how much and to what extent are we really? If I were to ask you these questions, what would you say? So, do other cultures exist? Well, some people don't think they do. Some people think we're all the same. Are other cultures inferior to mine? Well, having worked in this field for a long time, I often hear people say, well, we do it the right way, they do it the wrong way. This idea of better. Okay? Is it important to know about other cultures? Some people think it isn't. Do I view intercultural situations as an opportunity or a threat? Some people are frightened by intercultural situations. Okay, and how do I enjoy? Do I enjoy it? Is it fun for me, or do I really not enjoy meeting people from other countries? Okay, now this researcher called Milton Bennett, he created a tool called the IDI, which is basically placing people on this continuum from the people who denial of difference, who believe there is no difference, to those who are, who have integrated that difference and who are what we would call who have an intercultural mindset. So his questionnaire places you on this, and some companies use this with their expatriates to find out if they are capable of integrating a new culture, depending on where they are on this continuum. So it's an interesting thing to do. We all think we are, or we may think it is, but perhaps we have reticence with regards to some cultures rather than others. So an interesting exercise, and there's some extracts of the questionnaire that are available online if you're interested to see some of the questions and, more importantly, the results, because then it gives you indications of what you can do to improve certain intercultural skills. And then we need to just feed our curiosity. So we have to learn to become culturally savvy, savvy meaning knowledgeable. Okay, so what do? Well, we read guidebooks, we read novels, we watch films. We can actually go to specific websites and download country files if we're traveling and thinking of working in a specific country. We have expatriate associations all around the world. Okay, here in Paris there are many British ones. Should I want to relate, speak to other British nationals who have lived and worked here for longer than me to get some tips, and the same applies when you travel. And here in France, especially here in Paris, where there are loads of opportunities to meet people from different cultures, and you have that already within your own kind of entity here at the school. So take up the opportunity, have that culture discussion, ask people what is it they do in their countries, how do they live, how do they work, what's acceptable, what isn't. How do they dress? Why? Okay? Take an interest. And finally, the essential skill, which is emotional intelligence. Basically, nurturing that curiosity, that capacity to open your mind to other things that are different, that may seem threatening or make you feel kind of frightened, but in fact are a way open to a new world. Develop also your empathy, so your capacity to see things from another person's perspective, to see what it is like for them, not just what it's like for you with regards to a situation. Okay? And this is probably the most difficult thing to do, is to suspend judgment. When you meet and work with someone from a different culture and they've done something to offend you or upset you or something that you don't appreciate, our first reaction is to reject that person and say, no, thank you, don't want to work with you again. Well, the trick here is to say, okay, I don't like what they've done, it's offended me, but I'm going to try and understand what happened there. And as I say, this is probably the hardest thing to do, especially when you have a deadline, especially when, you know, the boss is on your back or the team has to get something out delivered by the end of the week. It's very difficult, so the challenge is there. Okay, so developing cultural intelligence is an essential skill, in my opinion, for the 21st century, especially in our global economy. So something I invite you all to do. So, what have I talked about today? I talked about culture. We've exchanged our ideas about what culture is. I've introduced the cultural model for you, the iceberg, the idea that culture is visible, is what we see with our eyes. And it's gone. No, it's gone. And that most cultural differences are not visible with our eyes. So we need to kind of get our antenna out to understand what's really going on in intercultural relations. I invite you to look at the cultural dimensions that the experts have identified for us if you want to know more about differences and how to overcome them. And I invite you to work on your cultural intelligence so that we can work more effectively in our intercultural teams. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm all yours. Does anyone have any questions or would like to share a story about what it's like to live and work in an intercultural context? Oh, they have a lady here who has a question. Hello.
Which advice is given to the manager
Yeah.
who has to manage multicultural team?
The advice is first to know how he feels. I think what I tried to say earlier, which is he or she needs to understand first what culture means to them, to really get to the bottom of how they feel about working with other cultures. As I say, on the surface, we think we can get on with anyone and everyone, that we're competent professionals. We are. However, faced with certain situations and with certain cultures, we can really feel outside of our comfort zone. So what I do in coaching is try and get people to raise their awareness about that, how they feel about cultures, how they feel about being in a situation with people they really don't understand, and then working through the mechanisms of identifying what we have in common, what we can, what we want to achieve, and how we can communicate that so that the other person can hear it. So by decoding, basically, cultural differences. So it's a lesson in empathy, in listening, and lots of patience. That's what I would say. Do you share that? Is that your experience too? Okay. Any other questions?
Have you ever been in contact with someone who didn't want to try to accept difference, refuse to
Yeah, you get that. It happens, absolutely. You meet people who are, I think, feel threatened by difference, and who feel threatened because they don't understand. They've lost all their kind of references, so they feel out of their depth. So yes, you do come across them. And the difficulty with intercultural management as a rule, I'm here telling you what you should do to learn those skills, and I think they're important, and I'm trying to learn them myself. But you're going to meet lots of people who are way behind you in terms of that self-development. When we're looking at the continuum, there are a lot of people who are stuck in the denial of difference, who don't believe it exists or who think it doesn't matter, which means that they minimize the impact of intercultural differences. So you will meet that all the time. So depending who you work with or who you share your space with, as it were, there will be people who are more or less mature, if I can say, on the subject. So it's up to you to adapt and perhaps help them overcome their fears. So by raising awareness and sharing things about your own journey in order to, show them that it's okay. That's what I would do. So yes, it happens. Any other questions? Yeah.
How is it possible when you spend some time in another country with other people, like for 1 year, 2 years, something like that, and when you come back, just readapt yourself, but you're just a little bit disappointing about your own culture? How is it possible?
It's the same approach as when you come into a new culture. What's interesting about intercultural travel is that you do get a new perspective of your own culture. So you learn things about your culture that you don't actually like, or you feel disappointed with, as you say, or you actively reject. So when you come back into your own culture, you have that vision but most people around you don't. So it's very difficult to share that, and people don't. There's no one that you can share with. So when you go into a new culture, you keep ties with your old culture. You keep ties, and you have comfort zones like food or cinema or books or whatever. So when you go back home, it's the same thing. You keep ties with the other culture. You keep ties through the things you do experience. It's exactly the same mechanism, because you will be forever transformed, and people won't always understand that, and you have to accept that. They can't understand it.
Yeah, we have to accept that, but it's quite difficult to find also people who live the same thing, and we can't speak about that with them, because with people who never understood this and never lived it, it's not really possible to speak about that because they can't really understand.
I agree, which is why it's that the challenge is finding people who have. Which is why in lots of communities there are expat communities. There are lots of things going on online where people talk about their experiences because they're seeking that understanding. So it does exist, but it doesn't exist in the format that you're used to, or perhaps in the world that you are in. So you have to look beyond your borders to find that. That's what I found. Okay. Can I give you a little intercultural coaching session to finish? Remember I told you about Edward Schein saying that the trick is to get beyond our cultural stereotypes and to identify, most importantly, what we share rather than what we have that is different. So to finish off today, I have a little challenge for you. Talk to your neighbor. Ask them 3 cultural questions and determine what you have that's the same and what's different about your cultures. It's a little challenge for you. So try and identify by talking to the person sitting next to you. Find out something about their culture. Okay? Now, culture meaning the big sense of the word. That could be corporate, regional, national, okay, professional, I don't care. Ask them about their culture. Where do you come from? Where do you work? What's specific? Okay? And in that discussion, try and identify things that are the same, okay? Not just what's different. Over to you. So what's it like? Is it easier to find something that you have, that you share, or is it easier to find something that is different? Okay. Okay, so what was harder, finding things in common or finding things that were different? So what do you say? What was easier? Okay.
Merci beaucoup, Joanna. On peut l'applaudir. La semaine prochaine, on aura une causerie sur l'utilisation des réseaux sociaux. Donc,